Hello, and welcome to another book chat format discussion of the Max Planck Institute for Social Anthropology. My name is Jovan Maud. I'm an editor here at the Institute. And today we're actually not doing a book chat, but rather a discussion of a special issue of a journal, the Journal of Global Buddhism, a journal that I co-edit with others. And the topic of this special issue is Buddhism in the Anthropocene. Today I've been joined by my partner in crime, Saskia Abrahms-Kavunenko, who is an anthropologist, currently a senior fellow at the Freiburg Institute for Advanced Studies. Welcome, Saskia.
Thanks, Jovan.
Yeah. Saskia and I co-edited this special issue, and we're going to be talking about the background to that, how the special issue came to be, and the various themes that we discussed. We're also joined by Frederik Schöer, a historian from the Center for the History of Emotions at the Max Planck Institute for Human Development in Berlin. Welcome, Frederik.
Thank you.
Frederik also contributed an article to the special issue, and so we're happy that you're able to come along and discuss the special issue with us and, you know, your contribution to it as well.
My pleasure.
Welcome to you both. So the topic, Buddhism in the Anthropocene, I mean, we'll get to that in a minute and talk about, you know, what our understanding of Buddhism and the Anthropocene and their relationship, what that is. But first of all, I wanted to just talk a little bit about how the special issue came to be, because actually it goes back a little bit into the history of the Institute. Here, Saskia, I didn't mention before, was also a researcher here at our Institute, and we met doing another book chat a couple of years ago now on a book called Monks, Morality and Money.
Monks, Money and Morality,
okay.
yeah.
Monks, Money and Morality.
Okay.
All right, I can live with that. Yeah. It's a couple of years ago.
Yeah.
And that was based on a project that was run by Christoph Bruhlmann here at the Institute on temple economies in urban Asia. And you were here researching in part to do with that. But at the same time, as I found out when we were talking together, that environmental questions are actually very central to your research. And at the same time, you're finishing up your monograph. Yeah. Would you like to maybe just say a little bit about that?
Yeah, I'd love to. So at the time I was working on a monograph which was on Mongolian Buddhism, or I'd recently finished a monograph on Mongolian Buddhism. And I was looking in particular at lay Buddhist practices in Ulaanbaatar, the capital city, and how they were being influenced by Ulaanbaatar's chronic air pollution. Mm-hmm. So the air pollution itself was taking on a kind of metonymic force within the city and within rituals. So I was looking at how people were carrying out practices of purification, but also of how people understood the air pollution as kind of this obscuration in every aspect of their lives, whether it came to be the Mongolian economy, mm-hmm. or whether it was something about, you know, coming fortunes for themselves or for their family members.
Okay.
So the book kind of explores air pollution and how it sort of is a stand-in for people's issues in their day-to-day lives, but also how it's I guess, how it physically was influencing people's lives in their bodies.
And specifically how the particular Buddhist idioms were then used for sort of understanding the pollution. Yeah.
To some extent.
To some extent, right. Okay. Uh-huh. All right, but that's how we got talking about this kind of environmental questions in relationship to Buddhism. So I myself, as is editor of the Journal of Global Buddhism, which is a journal that's, as the name suggests, is dedicated to understanding Buddhism as a global phenomenon, so thinking beyond maybe old-fashioned ways of thinking about Buddhism as essentially an Asian phenomenon, to consider the processes of globalization, migration, the cultural flows and so on, and looking at that from various aspects. And one topic that, you know, I had been wanting to deal with for a long time is to think about questions of global environmental concern. And we hadn't really done that up until that point with the journal. And when I got talking to you, I saw the opportunity to do something about this, to actually try to rethink how we thought about the notion of the global. Because up until that point, the idea of the globalization and so on, is to think about the planet in its, well, not really to think about the planet, but to think about the globe as a background to human activity, but not to consider what role does the planet play in human activity. So, or, in relationship specifically to Buddhism. So here we got talking and we thought, okay, let's try it. Let's maybe organize a workshop. And we're looking for a topic, and when we decided on the title Buddhism in the Anthropocene. Yeah. So maybe we can get into this question of like the Anthropocene and why we chose that topic. And maybe Saskia, you first, what utility did you see in using that term?
Yeah, so I think in many ways, the Anthropocene is quite a controversial kind of naming in some framings. But we were really using it as a shorthand, as a way of kind of engaging the concatenating crises which are kind of occurring on the planet at this time. I mean, many scholars have referred to this kind of post-1950s period as being the Great Acceleration or something like that, where we've seen an increase in biodiversity loss, climate crises, deforestation, consumption practices. I mean, at the moment, I'm looking at plastics, and the 1950s is really where you start to see this great increase in problems to do with plastics and their attendant kind of pollution problems. So I think that this kind of growing sort of escalation of concatenating crises is really encompassed in the term the Anthropocene, as problematic as it is. And it's a great shorthand as a way of kind of inviting scholarly discourse around questions to do with how people are embedded within the context in which we find ourselves.
Right.
Precisely as you're saying, to actually rewrite human experience in context, because we're not just human beings and gravity is the only force that's affecting us. We are animals. And so how do we see ourselves in that kind of context?
Yeah.
Which I think is also something that Frederik has really engaged in his paper.
So we put out the call, Buddhism in the Anthropocene, and we actually got a very huge response. Actually, we had it obviously struck a nerve, and so people like Frederik submitted paper ideas. So maybe for you, like, why did you feel like a topic like the Buddhism in the Anthropocene was an interesting frame to think through?
I came across the call for papers at a moment when I had quite recently started my postdoctoral research project. So I had shifted from working on migration, the history of migration in 20th century South Asia, to working on largely environmental history in colonial South Asia. And so I came to the topic as a sort of, as a historian, and came to the Anthropocene in a moment where I was interested in the sort of history that led up to the Anthropocene. So at that same time, I was teaching a seminar in Berlin at the Freie University, which was sort of really concerned with the entanglement of colonial history and environmental history, and how that sort of preconditions the developments that then later become sort of framed under the Anthropocene moniker. And so for me, it was really interesting to see Buddhism in the Anthropocene as sort of, how did we get there? How did we slide into this sort of combination of Buddhism and the Anthropocene? And then obviously, how does Buddhism sort of situate itself in that, in the different ways that we study the different communities? So for me, in that sense, working on South Asian Buddhists in the colonial period, what I saw was not only do they have a particular relation to environments and environmental change that is already happening, mostly because of interventions of the colonial state, but they're also going back to the much older ancient South Asian Buddhist tradition, going back to early South Asian Buddhism in the Pali texts, etc. So I was kind of following my actors into the thought worlds that they were going into. And they were drawing on this to make sense of the reality that they found themselves in the late 19th century and the early 20th century. And so the sort of experiment that I tried with my contribution to the workshop was, okay, can we sort of, what if we continue this? What else can we draw from that tradition for the present moment that we find ourselves in today?
Okay, right, thanks, yeah. And so in like deciding which contributions we would want to have in the workshop, we decided really that we didn't want to take general papers that sort of like theorizing Buddhism as a whole, or the Anthropocene as a whole, so much as make a collection of very specific case studies and see how they sort of spoke to each other. Saskia, that was the idea, right?
Yeah. So we were really trying to look at these studies, much like Frederik's, where it was addressing a particular kind of context, so how human beings are embedded within their context. And I think that that's really the contribution that this special issue has, is that there was a lot of very good abstracts that were sent through, and we decided to focus more on that kind of the lived experience, whether that be a historical one or from a geographer's perspective, or people in a forest, as we see in Prabhat Siransena's article, or a very big city such as Shenzhen, which we see in Kai Chmushko's article. Yeah,
right. Okay.
About urban China. Yeah.
So we had all these different case studies. We had cases from Sri Lanka, from China, from Taiwan, from India,
Ladakh,
Nepal, Ladakh, and so
also
on.
The United Kingdom
from
and
Australia as well. Yes, all right. We had people presenting and talking about Extinction Rebellion and how Buddhism was being an influence there. Eco-anxiety in Vietnam. We had a lot of different contributions around the place. And then from there, we've taken a selection of papers and ended up with 6 substantive articles and a thematic introduction that you and I wrote, with case studies from Sri Lanka, from China, from India, historical context from Inner Asia, and
Australia.
Nepal and Australia, not to forget Australia. Yes.
Yeah.
Okay. So, I guess it would be nice now to get into a little bit your own contributions and how they talk with the other ones in the special issue. So, could I start with you, Saskia?
Yeah, sure. I think there was a bunch of emergent themes that which were kind of happening within all of our different papers.
Yeah. And your article, what was it about?
Yeah. Thanks, Jovan. Thanks for asking me that question.
I could ask Frederik what your paper was about, if you like. Yes.
I think one of the really nice things about this the special focus and is in the kind of the first article, we see this beautifully written piece by Prabhat about the monks kind of engaging a colony
forest monks in Sri Lanka.
Forest monks in Sri Lanka engaging a colony of ants, and he writes that one of the monks that's come before him has kind of signaled to the other monastics that there is indeed a pathway of ants by kind of moving around some twigs. And then he's aware of that and he doesn't then step on the ants. And some time later he comes back and someone who's probably a layperson has come past and not noticed this because of how attentive their religious practice, their ritual practice is kind of has made them aware of their surroundings. And I think that that's also something that emerges from my paper is this idea of kind of receptivity to, one's surroundings and to the different
So for
animals.
people who are viewing, this video and they don't know what your paper's about, so it's focused in Western Australia. You're looking at a Buddhist centre there that's located in a fairly remote setting with mostly lay Buddhists. And you're interested in this question of how people sort of conceive their relationship to their local environment, right?
Yeah, so I'm looking at I'm an anthropologist, so I'm looking at contemporary Buddhist practice in a small town called Balingup, which is 2.5 hours south of Perth, which is the major city in Western Australia, and how people are engaging animals and the ecologies that they are surrounded by. So part of what I look at is how work is kind of understood in this context, and work, both spiritual work, but also like physical work on this hillside in which the centre is kind of set. And part of what I'm sort of offering, I guess, in a sense, is that human beings are there and they're labouring both spiritually and physically on the hillside, and the appearance of native animals, in particular animals like cockatoos, which are very common. Well, they're not that common actually, but they are in this context. How they are sort of being understood when they arrive as being a sort of sign that both religious practice and also physical labour has been carried out correctly on the hillside. So that's one of the things.
And there is this sort of ambivalence in a sense in relationship to native flora and fauna, because you have this distinction between the native and the introduced also, and how people deal differently with different species and so on.
Yeah, so I think that the Australian context is very interesting in that, famously we have a lot of kind of animals which people are concerned about, right? Sharks, crocodiles, spiders. It's something that most people think of when they think of Australia. And I think that it's interesting that Australians have a particular kind of relationship with where they are and the ecologies that surround them. We're very used to seeing denuded ecologies. We're very used to fires. We're very used to flooding. And so I think Australians have a particular kind of sort of relationship with the ecologies in which they live. And that's also something that I wanted to draw out in the paper. There is a particular emphasis on the health of the landscape being related to the reappearance or presence of native animals, which I think you don't see in other contexts. And that also means that there's a sort of logic of care in place that Australians, if we, because there's been so much history of invasive species, which many people would know about, in the case of the rabbit or the cane toad, that Australians sort of, if the landscape is to be one which has the presence of kind of the species of plants or of animals which were, previously there before colonization, then it does kind of require this kind of constant work of, getting rid of weeds and etc.
Right. Okay.
Of course, the communities that were there before colonization, Aboriginal people also did this very active care work on the landscape as well in the.
And bringing it back to Buddhism, of course, is this question of how spiritual practice isn't just an internal thing, but it's something that's very, very intrinsically related to one's environment. Yeah, and this is the theme that you deal with, Frederik, in your paper in great detail, right? With this notion of affective entanglements. Would you like to introduce what your paper's about?
Sure. Yeah. My paper focuses or puts forward this idea of affective entanglement as sort of a way that we can understand both things that we find in the ancient Buddhist textual tradition, as well as perhaps something that we can use for today. And so, in many ways, my paper is a very sort of textual focused paper. I mostly work with in that paper mostly work with Pali texts and Sanskrit texts from the South Asian tradition. And so in some ways you could say that it's, in a disciplinary sense, in terms of Buddhist studies, it's sort of, this is a very kind of conservative approach to Buddhist studies.
Yes.
And I found it particularly interesting that in the workshop sort of generated a space where we could also reflect on what does the Anthropocene mean for Buddhist studies in a sort of disciplinary, larger sense. And so I think my paper is goes some ways into that reflection. Matthew King's paper, for example, spells this out very clearly.
Yes.
And we can discuss that later.
Yeah.
And so what I'm sort of looking at is in the text, how are environments conceived of in the text, and how is the sort of the human relation to these environments sort of understood in the Buddhist text. And very often, Buddhist traditions have been stereotyped as being about the management of emotions or the freeing of emotions. You get to a stage where emotions don't really touch you anymore. But then when we look at, say, ancient practice manuals of meditation, very often they are embedded in natural environments. You go to the forest, you go to a remote place, you go to sit down at the root of a tree, etc. And B, emotions are everywhere in these texts, literally. They are drenched in them. And so they are very central to the practice embedded in these environments. And very often, as I discuss in my paper, these emotions are not positive ones. I mean, they can be, but then often also there comes fear, for example, or literal terror that you might experience in the forest, because the forest is a dangerous place, and because the forest also is a terrifying place in the sense that you sort of sometimes expect it to be a fearful place. And then the interesting thing that I found is that the Buddhist tradition, or in particular in these texts, the Buddha himself as a figure who is usually in dialogue with other interlocutors in the format of teaching, doesn't deny this and doesn't say, okay, free yourself of these emotions. Here is how you can master them. And, we can all be free of fear. He doesn't say this. He says, yes, same thing happened to me, sitting down in the forest, becoming frightened. And you sort of practice through it. And that practicing through the emotions is why I think that, something that I call affective entanglement is so central to the tradition, because the tradition doesn't deny that we are intimately connected to our environments through the transmission belt of feelings, you could say. And that, I think, has a lot to say in a larger sense about the conception of the human in the Buddhist tradition, which can speak also to the larger Anthropocene debate. Because we can see in all kinds of different disciplines how the moniker of the Anthropocene is being criticized as, what is that anthropos who is in the Anthropocene? And what does that hide? What does it occlude? What is the sort of hegemonic idea of the human that is can be written into that moniker? And then when we go to a tradition like the early South Asian Buddhist tradition, we see that the conception of the human is radically different from, I don't know, say a Cartesian kind of conception of the human, where you would typically locate emotions, for example, in human interiority, in a sort of almost airtight space where you could be, your passions are welling up, etc., etc. Now, that doesn't happen at all, or doesn't match at all with the psychology of early Buddhism that practitioners until today, as Prabhat Sirisena is also showing so powerfully in his paper, are sort of embodying in their practice. They are, these texts are not just sort of ancient, revered artifacts, but they also have this abiding contemporaneity in the sense that they are taught, they are read, they are engaged with, they are debated in some traditions. And so the tradition conceives of the human as fundamentally open, as a sort of there is the doctrine of the non-self. There is the doctrine of the sort of the fact that the human, just like other beings in the world, are all impermanent and assembled. So there is no constituent inherent core to us that would hold our soul or our emotions or whatever. Instead, we emerge in this sort of direct touch, as the texts say, with the world. And from that touch, all kinds of things happen. And in the sense of my paper, I focus on emotions that are happening. And they're happening both in the practitioners, who may get overwhelmed in the forest, but they also happen in all kinds of non-human beings. So, for example, in the later half of my paper, I talk about trees in particular, and how they're conceived of as the seats of deities. But then these deities have this sort of ambiguous relation. Is the tree just sort of my home? Do I live in the tree? Or is the tree also my body? And there is a slippage, a textual slippage there that I think is very interesting and that is very productive, because it allows the audience of the text, meaning the practitioners or us as the readers, to go into that ambivalence and see what happens if it's possible to imagine that there is a living being that takes the body of a tree and has powerful emotions when that tree is about to be cut down for other purposes. And then perhaps enacts a Buddhist ethic or, evokes strong feelings in someone else. And I think that is there is a fundamental possibility for an ethics of care there that stems from the sort of mutual acknowledgement of vulnerability. Not just in humans, and we see this vulnerability now so acutely in the sort of present circumstances on a planetary scale with climate crises, pollution, extinction, etc., etc. But we also see it beyond the human. And that's, I think, what unites a lot of the papers. You know, that's what, Saskia, you already mentioned. You focus on animals, especially who are acutely vulnerable in particular environments. But there's also this codependency that we are in a moment where we don't say, well, okay, it might be too late. Australian environments are changing, as you were saying. If we let them, it'll be blackberries all over. But because of this sort of impulse of care that stems from this recognition of vulnerability, there is also the potential for an intervention.
Yes. And this notion like of intervention of cultivation, in a sense, sort of comes through a lot, that we're in the various different examples where we're talking about an interrelationship, between humans and their non-human environments.
And that has a long history. Right? As I think this is what Alice Millington, for example, shows so brilliantly in her paper, focusing on a particular Buddhist community in Nepal, up in the Himalayas, which, of course, by and large is conceived as a very remote region. You might imagine that it's very out of touch with whatever we define as Anthropocene kinds of developments. And for one, she shows that it's totally enmeshed in it, because of climate change, because of changing weather patterns, because of pollution, because of capitalism coming in, because of political issues, because it sits on the border between Nepal and China. But then also that there is this longer history to those interactions. So she brilliantly shows how that community has a very deep, very long tradition of engaging with environments and conceiving of the sort of more than human world and how humans engage with them and how you do that through your religious practice, through your social practices, in your everyday life, in particular ritualized occasions, etc., etc.
Yeah, I mean, I guess in some ways the Anthropocene sort of brings up particular kinds of notions that we treat as novel when we're thinking about Euro-American thought or so on, and yet we need to bear in mind how other global traditions have not made the same kind of assumptions about the relationship between humans and the natural world.
And I think that's also something that Matthew King brings to the fore as well in his paper, where he talks about, trying to basically bring the more than human world back into Buddhist studies, like to take out the sort of the humanist approach to Buddhist studies itself.
Right. So his argument is to point to this humanist bias in Buddhist studies, right? So do you want to say a bit more about that?
Yeah. So his argument is basic. So he takes up Dipesh Chakrabarty's challenge, saying that the Anthropocene sort of is a fundamental challenge or spells a crisis for the humanities disciplines. And Matthew's intervention is saying, yes, and that might not be so bad. And where do we go from there? And he's saying, well, let's look at the things that we have always been working on. Let's look at the sources, but not just make them objects of study in the sense that we sit here and the text is there and we're kind of looking at it and we analyze it in a philological way or, whatever kind of way whatever lens that we are applying. But we also take the sort of the lessons from these texts to heart. And the lesson being, as Matthew argues, that the nature-culture dyad, which Chakrabarty sees as at the sort of root of the problem that the Anthropocene spells for the humanities, because the humanities, in the sense that they are conceived in hegemonic sort of scholarship, is inherently coded with this nature-culture binary. And he's saying in the text that he is studying, these sort of inner Asian texts that are circulating between Mongolia, Qing, China, Tibet, and other places also, that binary doesn't apply at all. It doesn't make sense. And if we look for it, that's an act of epistemic violence performed on the sources. Instead, see what the sources say, and they lead you to a very different kinds of place. They lead you to the realization that there are all kinds of worlds, that it depends on the perception, and there are all kinds of perceivers. And so humans are, one perspective of perception of the world, and there are all kinds of others, and they coexist. And so in that sense, I think it meshes so well also with your paper, especially also, I think, with the very poignant intervention in your paper of bringing in landscape art as a particular way of seeing these different ways of inhabiting the world, different ways of being in the world, making them sort of visible, but also in the act of creation happening upon them, right? As in the example of the Marin's Claw in your article.
So what is the example of the Marin's Claw?
What is this?
What is
this Marin? This Marin. So in the paper, I start with visiting an artwork with a friend, and she described how basically the artwork is not really there for humans to view. In a sense, it's there to discourse with the ecologies in which she made the artwork. And as she was making the artwork, she kept coming across this kind of, it's a sort of crayfish, like an
so the artwork was being done in sort of like a dried out creek bed, right?
A dried out creek bed. Yeah. And so she came across this marin, which is a type of crayfish, and the claw of this marin kept popping up above the surface. And she thought at the time, which later she found out wasn't correct, that this, was kind of, the animal was having a problem. She kept trying to cover it back in the sand, that it was being disturbed by her. Yeah. But she made the artwork in collaboration and conversation with this marin. So that's why it's the shape of a marin's claw, which is hence the title of the article is The Marin's Claw. But it's interesting because it's not about engaging with other human people. It's about engaging with these ecologies and their sort of desperate calling or yearning for water, in this case of this dried out creek bed.
Right. And what it suddenly occurred to me here, I don't know if this makes sense, but the way you were describing this receptivity and this, the sort of interaction with the natural, what we call the natural environment, problematic as that might be, but with non-human animals and with plants and so forth, landscapes. But then you were describing Matthew King's intervention in relationship to the humanities, and what you seem to be describing was also a kind of way in which we as scholars maybe have to also adopt a similar kind of receptivity to the texts that we're working with, like whether this notion of affective entanglement also applies at that level. Do you think that's nonsense, or is there something to that?
In terms of our interaction with our objects of study?
Yeah, because you were describing the way that we a movement away from this idea of the text is out there, and I can analyze it from this sort of analytical distance to a different form of relationship with the text.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I think for a long time, I don't know, I mean, at least in the way that I was sort of acculturated into this tradition, because I have a background in Tibetan and Buddhist studies, which was a sort of very kind of philological path. It was its own kind of binary, in the sense that either you study the text from a scientific perspective or you're religious. And if you're religious, you don't have an objective perspective. And if you are having that scientific perspective, you might not really have the sort of insight into the deeper layers of meaning of the text, which are esoteric. Mm-hmm. Right. So both sides kind of criticize one another for failing to account to dimensions that are in the text or about the text, or, how the text is embedded into larger societies. And what I my approach is this sort of irreverence, in the sense that I think that the text they have so much to offer, always exceeding what we think is in the text, that they are historical at the same time as they are still in the present, and they speak to the present, and they have this potential to the present. And once I think we depart from discourses of doctrinal purity, of, sort of scientific objectivity in a box, etc., then we can ask all kinds of other questions about the text, and perhaps say, what sort of concepts, ideas, ways of thinking does it offer us to sort of think through, feel through, attend to issues that we personally find ourselves in the present, or that we perceive more generally in the present moment.
Yeah, and I mean, another aspect, if we go somewhere a little bit different, we haven't talked about Kai Shmushko's piece really so far in any detail, but so she's looking at a particular urban context in China, and there's notions of these sort of eco-villages that are created, and massive Buddhist temples in the forest and so on. So yeah, like how could we bring her piece into these broader themes, do you think?
I think first and foremost, it's so important because we are always also facing the stereotype of Buddhism being a particularly green or easily amenable to environmental concerns type of philosophy or religion. And as many scholars, including Johan Elveskog, have shown, that's not inherently true. And that's also not true in terms of the history of the lived religion, is that Buddhism has always been a highly urban religion and has had then particular kinds of maybe romanticized or other perceptions of natural environments, right? And so I think Kai's cool intervention is that she sort of takes this up and sort of switches the camera around, right? And shows us environments that are highly urban and highly denaturalized in many ways.
Yes.
But still, all of these concerns that we were talking about in the workshop, all of these larger concerns that are brought together by the Anthropocene as a sort of perspective, really are so relevant to that paper, no?
Mm-hmm. I mean, of course, the Anthropocene, especially in its like current, instantiation, is one which is highly urban. So, and she talks about the seas of cement and how different ideas of environmental pollution are kind of playing out within this rather large temple complex. So on the one hand, she has, these kind of like practices where people are trying to carry out purification are also being in some ways curbed by the state, which is saying we don't want to have environmental pollution, but perhaps these are more sort of like conversations which are about we don't want to have superstition. And I think that her paper really speaks to these kind of different dynamics of the state and the social life and the ecological life and also individual practice, which is very interesting.
In that sense, it sort of specifically talks about an issue that I think is inherent in almost all of the papers, which is power structures, right? Which is such a huge issue when we talk about the Anthropocene, when we talk about climate crisis, etc., which is there when we talk about monastic communities, as Prabhat Sirisena does, which is there when we talk about Australia and sort of the particular history or also failings of the Australian state in terms of the particular environments that you're talking about, which is also, as I already mentioned there in Alice's paper, in terms of how that local community is integrated into much larger power structures that all have different agendas and all have different impacts. And Kai really sort of spells it out.
I actually really like how Matthew King's piece talks to this sort of like perspectivism as well, which is not something that you necessarily associate with Buddhist texts. But he talks about how in the Zara Damdin that he's talking about, who's writing in the 1930s, which is a very tumultuous time in Asia, how he is talking about these different kind of angles of perception that different actors or different beings can have. So, I think he mentions that water for human beings is nectar for the long-living long-living gods and
pus
for hungry ghosts. For hungry ghosts,
right.
Yeah. Which is kind of a nice, also an alternative view of Buddhist texts, which we don't.
Yeah, in a sense, it's a call to positionality, right? I mean, similar to how we do that in certain academic disciplines of being very sort of self-conscious about our own positionality in the sense of our engagement with the wider world. There's also a need for that positionality. And perhaps sort of boiling it down to a basic realization of what's good for me is not necessarily good for someone else, or what's bad for me might be necessary, or might be sort of vitally important for other kinds of beings, or in a larger sense, I guess, ecologies and other systemic structures. Yeah, and to me, it's also really interesting, this sort of the question of, as Matthew also gets to, what is it, sort of what the tradition talks about when it talks about the world. And it seems like it's a sort of, it's a quotidian term, right? We are in the world, sitting here, the world is out there. As you were saying, Jovan, there is that same kind of question about globality versus the planetary.
Yes.
What is excluded and what is included in the perspective that we have on the world.
Yes.
And the same thing happens with different Buddhist traditions when they talk about the world. Is it sort of the world seen from the sort of head of the perceiver? Is it a world that is constituted by the interaction of different perspectives? Then always in Buddhism, of course, it is a world that is fundamentally marked by suffering. It's a world that is sort of, by the Buddhist diagnosis generally, is not nice to be in, right? So somehow at the end, there is the goal of transcending it, of getting out of it, of sort of being able to sort of lift yourself from that muck. But it takes a long time.
Yes.
Right? And so as you are also talking in your article about work, or Alice is also talking about sort of ritual work, there is a lot of energy that is needed in terms of sort of being in the world and being in the face of that it's difficult to be in the world.
And actually also, I think with the Anthropocene in its best line, it kind of says we are the world, So it's not just that we are in the world, we are actually the world. So that from the Buddhist perspective is very, I think, kind of interesting as well.
So you're just taking me back to 1980s, pop songs at the moment, But sorry, we are the world. No, but this... is this one of the key lessons that focusing on sort of Buddhism, in the Anthropocene helps us to come to terms with this being in the situation, this very situation characterized by suffering.
Yeah.
In a localization. And then how to deal with that.
The localization, the in. Right? As we touched on already, there are debates on when do we say that the Anthropocene begins, what are the factors that contribute, We are not getting into that. We're using the Anthropocene as a sort of as a way of stirring up debate in the workshop, in the special issue, bringing in all kinds of perspectives. And so all the different perspectives are in the Anthropocene in their own ways, in different ways, showing communities that deal with this in profoundly different ways. Still, I don't think that it's only about the difference. This is not just about that each case study is so different in its own right that they don't speak to one another. They profoundly speak to one another in so many different ways.
Very much so. Yeah.
You know, the connection of animals, the connections of the sort of beyond animals, non-human world, the connection of care for environments, ethics of care, love, urbanity, the world, etc.
Power structures.
Power structures. All of that unites it. And so I think it's less about the differences than about what emerges when we assemble these differences.
Yes.
What do we see once we bring all of that to the table? And in the workshop, we did that in a larger sense because there were more contributors also. Not all of them in the end ended up in the special issue. And I think that also points to the future in the sense that I didn't get the feeling either in the workshop or in the special issue that there was a particular point where we wanted to get to. It wasn't like we have to find an answer to this problem. Posing the problem as Buddhism in the Anthropocene, or the issue as Buddhism in the Anthropocene, doesn't mean what's the solution. Can we produce another master narrative? Can we sort of settle a debate? Can we decide on something? No, that's not at all what the project was. And so in a sense, the project is open-ended, sort of perhaps gets a ball rolling that hopefully rolls further.
Yeah, because as I was saying before, we have these big pollution problems now. I mean, I'm currently looking at plastics, and it's a classic example of a very intractable pollution problem that even if we stopped plastic production today, which we show no signs of doing, as you know, there is the problem of heritage plastics. Plastics are everywhere. Plastics are in us. And so I think that we need to kind of learn how to both contribute as best we can to alleviating these concatenating crises, but also learn to be in the world which is been, you know, shaped by various actors, which is one which has the marks of human beings, though unevenly so. It is kind of, you know, present in the stratigraphic record, perhaps.
Right. And so it's not saying, oh, Buddhism has the answer. Buddhism is one way, offers actually many ways of perceiving this, of sort of locating ourselves in a particular world that is inhabited in different ways by other beings, in a way of being in the world that is very open to the world. And there are all kinds of other traditions that have all kinds of other ways of perceiving this, of sort of conceptualizing this kind of relation. So we're not saying, okay, out with this concept, in with that concept, and everybody now subscribe to Buddhist philosophy or whatever, but that it's a generative perspective that we can sort of, it speaks to the present moment, as you're saying. It's sort of the way that the body is conceived of in Buddhism profoundly speaks to the realization that our bodies are filled with microplastics nowadays.
Yeah.
But that's just one perspective. I think it's what we also see in the face of particularly a phenomenon like the climate crisis, is the need for humility. So there is also a kind of disciplinary humility, you know? I think, like Matthew also spells it out, is that it can't be the project, oh, how can we sort of rescue a discipline that is perhaps run into a problematic avenue, but how can we have a sort of more humble a position towards ourselves as researchers and the projects that we do and the outcomes that we produce.
Yeah. No, something that's always appealed to me in Buddhist thought is this sort of avoiding extremes, you know, and the notion of the middle path and so on, and working from where you are rather than imagining some sort of, you know, magical escape. And I think in, you know, the Anthropocene context, we're looking at what you called in a previous conversation, you know, on the one hand, the sort of techno-bro utopianism, you know, the notion that we can engineer our way out of, there is a fix.
Yeah.
Yeah. And there's all kinds of forms of solutionism there. And at the other extreme, we have despair and just giving up. And where, you know, the appeal to me of thinking through these notions in a Buddhist lens is look at a tradition where the notion of suffering is taken as kind of a fundamental condition of existence, and that we don't run away from that insight. We don't imagine that there can be a quick fix to that.
Right. And that also in the ethics that it formulates, like Prabhat discusses the virtue ethics of the forest monks, which even in the Buddhist tradition, even in Sri Lanka, is perceived as a sort of radical, as an extreme ethics.
Yeah.
Because it's a very small number of monks that are not even in the larger established urban monastic centers, but they're really out there in the forest doing a very extreme kind of ascetic practice.
Yes.
And he, with a particular insight of the autoethnography that he brings to the table, in the sense that he was one of these
Yes.
forest monks.
Yes.
So he lived that life, and then for all kinds of reasons, he came out of it. And now he's making sense of it. Not in the sense of, how can we all become forest monks? Because it would be so great if we could all, sort of, let go of all of our worldly possessions, etc., etc. Well, wouldn't that be nice? But under the circumstances that we live in, maybe that's not directly possible. So then what else can we learn from that? And he derives profound lessons on love, which seems like such a commonplace, seems almost like such a hippie thing to say. But in his article, it's not at all. It's a very profound ecological intervention to focus on such an ethic and try to actualize it in a way that might be imperfect, that might be open to further change, but that definitely, I think, can help us practice in a better way than we have been before.
Yeah. Okay.
And love is difficult, right? I mean, it sounds like a hippie concept, but it's actually, when you get down to it, I mean, caring for animals and for ecologies and for one another is hard, and it needs more conversations. Like, we need to have more conversations about how to best do that in the current crises.
And the cultural specificity. I mean, of course, I'm speaking as a historian of emotions, so obviously I have to say that that love is highly particular.
Absolutely.
And that's what Prabhat, for example, also discusses, is that this is not a sort of European romanticist kind of notion of love. There is no sort of intimate element in the sense of zoophilia here, definitely not. And that's why there have been different kind of translations proposed for terms like metta. Is it loving kindness? Is it this? Is it that? And Prabhat settles on the fact that, okay, but in the context that I discussed, by and large, it's clear I can just use the word love, but we know that it's a very particular kind of cultural context. That's the power of these studies also, of bringing us into that cultural context, but then at the same time speaking to a larger debate.
Yeah. And in all of these contexts, we see the actors, or the people that we're kind of, discoursing with or looking at the text from, that they are, having their own difficulties, their own challenges, and they're kind of learning to live with those challenges, essentially.
Like learning to live with those challenges and through those challenges, right?
Exactly.
That's the whole point that I'm trying to make with the affective entanglement thing, is that we are in this state of entanglement. We are sort of, there is no getting away from the world. We are in it. And might as well realize that we are.
Yeah.
And instead of sort of struggling against that, also struggling against the sort of negative aspects of whatever sort of facet of climate change that we are facing in our day-to-day lives, we can try to struggle against it. And if we are highly privileged, perhaps, we can keep that up for a long time. Great. For the majority of the, global population of humans and non-human beings, that's not an option. So we need ways of dealing with that. If we can't go to the sort of tech bro fix, if we can't, board a spacecraft and fly to Mars, if we stay on the planet, we don't escape the planet. So then, okay, how can we sort of be more conscious of the way that we are in that relation, and work through it?
Yes. Yes. Okay. And as you said a couple of times, we haven't tried to close the debate or answer the question or say that there's nothing more to say in this topic. But on the contrary, if anything, all these different perspectives that we've opened up have shown that we're just scratching the surface, that we've just really begun a conversation.
And I think that really comes out in the introduction as well, the title of the introduction being Opening the Global to the Planetary, which is kind of like an invitation. I mean, this special issue is very much an invitation to kind of talk, to have more cases, where we need more examples of how people are living in the Anthropocene.
Yeah. Yeah. Buddhist or otherwise. Yeah.
Buddhist or otherwise.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, thanks. And I think that's probably a good point maybe to wrap things up and to say thank you, Saskia. Thank you, Frederik.
Thank you.
Thanks.
It's been a pleasure.
For a stimulating discussion. Thanks.